Hello, my name is Monica Cruz, and I serve as the State Data Center Lead for the Texas Demographic Center. The Texas Demographic Center, or TDC, functions as a focal point for the production, interpretation, and distribution of demographic information for Texas. We produce and disseminate population estimates and projections for the state, with special emphasis on demographic data that may be useful to policymakers in dealing with issues regarding the demand for state services. TDC is housed at the Institute for Demographic and Socioeconomic Research at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Lloyd Potter, who serves as the Texas State Demographer. He holds a PhD in demography and sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, a Master of Public Health from Emory University, a Master of Science in Education from the University of Houston at Clear Lake, and a Bachelor of Science from Texas A&M University. Today's presentation on population change and education in Texas will help focus on how the state's population has changed since the last census, particularly our student age population, to help us better understand the future of our Texas workforce population. The floor is yours, Dr. Potter.
Okay, thank you, Monica. I'm going to share my screen now. And so I'm going to go through and talk about a fair number of things related to demographics in Texas. And the first is our population change over the decade. So you can see here on this slide, it shows the states that grew significantly over the decade. And you can see that Texas is now over 29 million in terms of our total population as of April 1st, 2020. We added almost 4 million new Texans over the decade. And we were growing faster than all states except for two, and that's Utah and Idaho were the two that were growing faster, and they're substantially smaller than we are. So we grew at a rate of almost 16% over the decade. And we grew more than any other state, and I want to emphasize that. When we look at the population distribution in the state, you can see we have what we refer to as the population triangle, which is Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston as the points of the triangle. But the area is filling in very significantly in between them, in particularly along I-35. If we look at the I-35 corridor and count all the population along that corridor and east of it, it's about 87% of the total population in the state. And that really highlights the dichotomy, both in terms of the population distribution, as well as the demographic dynamics within the state. When we look at population change over the decade between the two censuses, 2010 and 2020, you can see that we have 254 counties, but 143 of them lost population. So all of these green counties lost population over the decade. Most of those are west of I-35, but you can see in East Texas, significant number of counties losing population. And then in South Texas as well. It's essentially all of these counties that are losing population are essentially rural counties or right next to being rural counties. But that doesn't take away from the fact that here we added more people than any other state. And that means that those people being added are those that are in the population, those counties that are adding population are those in the population triangle. And that also emphasizes that those counties are growing a lot. When we look at population change by race and ethnicity, we can see that essentially most of the population change can be attributed to growth of the population that is made up of persons of color. Only 4.7% of our population change over the decade can be attributed to growth of the non-Hispanic white population, whereas almost half of our total population change, so almost half of that 4 million growth, approaching 2 million, is attributable to growth of the Latino population in the state. But we also have significant growth of the Asian population, non-Hispanic other, which is largely persons who are classified as 2 or more races, and then the African American population. When we look at that and the shift that we've seen in the racial and ethnic composition over the decade, you can see the Latino population was 37.6% in 2010. 2010's on the left and 2020's on the right. And that percent increased to 39.3% by 2020. The non-Hispanic white population's percent declined from 45% to almost 40%. And you can see that the Latino population and the non-Hispanic white population are almost in parity as of the 2020 census. The African American population stayed about the same as a percentage of the total population. And the Asian population increased pretty dramatically, as well as this non-Hispanic other population, which again is largely persons who are 2 or more races. When we look at population change, it's made up of what we refer to as the components of change. And the 2 basic components are natural increase, which is births minus deaths. So over a period of time, you have so many children born and so many people dying, and the difference is natural increase. And then net migration, and that's in migration minus out migration. And here we've broken it out into international migration and domestic migration. When you look at our population change between 2000 and 2010, you can see that about a little less than a quarter of our total population was attributable to domestic migration, a little less than a quarter to international migration, and a little over half to natural increase. So our growth was really being driven that decade by more babies being born than people dying in Texas. When we look at 2010 to 2020, you can see then that less than half of our population change, or a little less than half, is attributable to natural increase, and a little more than half attributable to net migration, with almost a third of our population change being domestic migration. I think this is somewhat attributable, or my hypothesis for this is that coming out of the recession in 2010, Texas was very well positioned economically and was very attractive to potential movers looking for work. And so I think that was driving a lot of the domestic migration, and that ended up attributing more of our population growth to domestic migration than what we saw between 2000 and 2010. And then these bar charts here just show you this for each year. And you can see there's a fair amount of variation over the decade. When we look at population change geographically for looking at natural increase, so this is more births than deaths, you can see that a lot of our counties, 86 of our 254, about a third of our total counties, had natural decrease, more deaths than births. Those counties are the yellow and the green ones here, largely rural counties. And essentially what's happening in many of these counties is young people are aging up, and when they finish high school to get employment or to go to post-secondary education, they're going to have to leave their county. And when they do, they're probably moving to the population triangle or one of the urbanized areas out west. And when they do that, they're less likely to come back home. They're likely to then age into the reproductive years. And when they start having children, then they're having children in the urbanized areas, and they're not having them in these rural areas. And so when you look at these rural areas, you have an aging population with few children who are or younger adults who are in the reproductive ages, consequently fewer births occurring there, and consequently more deaths than births. But then if you look at the urban core counties, very significant number of births occurring, especially in the population triangle, Lower Rio Grande Valley, and El Paso. And so when we look at this component of change in terms of fertility, you can see we've seen significant declines in fertility since the recession, associated with the recession. When you look here, you can see that this total fertility rate of 2.1, that's the total fertility rate is the average number of children a woman has over her childbearing years. So if a woman on average, or women on average, have 2.1 children, they're going to replace themselves and the father of those children. And so if you think about that, that also means if there's a fertility rate above 2.1, we're likely to see population growth occurring. And then, of course, the opposite of that is if it's below 2.1, eventually, not immediately, but eventually, if it stays at below 2.1 for some period of time, we'll see population decline, assuming that there's no migration. And so when we look at the United States, it's been below replacement fertility since before 2008, which was the kind of the beginning of the recession. Texas was above it at the beginning of the recession, but by 2011, Texas fell below replacement fertility and has continued to decline in terms of replacement fertility or total fertility rate. Utah, which has historically had among the highest fertility, is now in 2018 below a total fertility rate of 2.1. And then, of course, other states have been below 2.1 for some time. And so when we look at Texas and look at birth rates, and these are births per 1,000 women that are in their childbearing years by race and ethnicity, you can see that African American, Asian, and non-Hispanic white have been fairly low, and their fertility has been fairly stable. But you can certainly see with the recession and kind of in the fairly recent years, declines in fertility in all of these race ethnic groups. But the one that is probably most prominent is the decline in fertility among Latinos, who have historically had pretty high fertility and have been driving much of the natural increase in Texas, but dramatic declines in fertility over the past decade. And so that then results in some implications for our age structure, because we're not adding as many children at the youngest ages. So when we look at population pyramids, and here we're looking at generational population pyramids, the one on the left is 2010, the one on the right, 2020. And if you look at the, in each column, in each pyramid, to the left of the center are males, and to the right of center are females, and then they're single years of age. But if you look here at the bottom of the 2010 pyramid, the 0 to 1, by 2020, that population has aged, that cohort has aged up to being 10 years of age. And if you look at the base of this pyramid, we're now seeing it is inverted. Essentially, that inversion means that cohort, these cohorts at the bottom in 2020, where we've had low fertility, fewer babies being born in Texas, are going to age up into preschool, kindergarten, primary and secondary education, and then our university system, and ultimately our labor force. So this declining set of these declining cohorts of young children are ultimately going to have reverberating effects in our educational systems as well as our labor force. So in about 20 years or so, we're likely to start seeing labor shortages unless that is somewhat offset by migration, and both domestic and international migration in the state. So certainly from an education perspective, we're seeing declining enrollments. And if you look at other states, and I think I'll talk about that here in a little bit, but we're seeing declining enrollment. And we'll start seeing that again, moving up into primary, secondary, and post-secondary education systems. So I've also talked about migration and domestic migration. Where are domestic migrants coming from? I think there tends to be a fair amount of media attention to the fact that Texas is receiving a lot of immigrants, or not immigrants, domestic migrants from California. Illinois is the second biggest sender over the last decade. New York, and then Florida. Puerto Rico has had significant outflow of young people. Louisiana has historically been a big sender to Texas as well. But Texas is losing population, migrants, domestic migrants, to Colorado, Oklahoma, Washington, Oregon, North Dakota. Most of this, we believe, it can be attributable to labor migration associated with the fracking industry, with oil extraction. When we look at the shifts that we've seen by race and ethnicity associated with migration in Texas, essentially, if you look here, the population that is higher or lower than the total population. So essentially the percent of migrants that are non-Hispanic white are smaller than the percent of the total population in Texas that are non-Hispanic white. When we look at African American, the domestic migrants are much more likely to be African American compared to the percentage of the population in Texas that is African American. When we look at Latino, there's a domestic migrants, there's fewer as a percentage of the domestic migrants are fewer than the total population, the non-migrant population, but immigrants are more likely to be Latino than the percent that are Latino in Texas. And then Asian, we can see both domestic as well as international migrants are more likely to be Asian than they are in the Texas population. And so certainly this probably is also, when you look at the domestic migration, probably a factor associated with migration from California, because certainly California has a very significant Asian population, and then also New York has a significant Asian population as well. When we look at the migrant characteristics compared to the total population, the resident population in Texas by educational attainment, you can see immigrants tend to be more likely to have less than high school compared to the resident population, whereas domestic migrants much less likely. So essentially for domestic migrants, they tend to have higher levels of educational attainment, generally speaking, than the Texas population. And that bears out when you start looking at bachelor's degree and graduate and professional degrees, as well as associate degrees. But less so for high school degrees, both international as well as domestic migrants. A smaller percentage have less than high school just a high school equivalent. Some college with no degree. Again, the domestic and international migrants less likely than Texas residents. Associate's degrees, you see less for international and more for domestic migrants. But then if you look at bachelor's degree and graduate and professional, overwhelmingly domestic and international migrants are likely to have higher levels of educational attainment than Texas residents. Or I guess I can have little arrows there pointing to that. And then here I want to look at the characteristics, the occupational characteristics of migrants, both international and domestic, compared to residents. And you can see that international migrants are much more, and so that, and when you look at the occupations, the ones on the left tend to be higher skilled, higher paid occupations. The ones on the right, lower skilled, lower paid. And so when you look at, I'm sorry, we're just comparing net migrants, they're not international. So it's non-migrants. So these are Texas residents in the blue, the green are net migrants, and then which is a combination of immigration as well as domestic migration. And so you can see that domestic migrants, or migrants, tend to have be more likely to be in management, business, financial occupations, more likely to be essentially, and I think I might have some, no, I don't have arrows with this one, more likely to be in many of these higher skilled, higher paid occupations. And then when you get to the lower skilled, lower paid, the migrants tend to be less likely. And then also migrants are domestic migrants, certainly less likely to be unemployed, and international migrants, because again, many of them aren't actually able to work if they migrate and they don't have a green card. So many of them are unemployed, but less, a smaller percentage overall compared to Texas residents. Then in this slide, I wanted to illustrate shifts that we're seeing in our labor force and what I think are in terms of occupational status. This slide shows the occupations that were on the previous one, except for I took out a bunch in the middle. And so the ones on the left here are higher skilled, higher paid. The ones on the right are lower skilled, lower paid. And we're comparing 2007 to 2017. And so essentially, if you added all of the gray columns up, plus the ones I left out in the middle, that would add to 100%. Same thing for the brown columns. If we added all of those up and the ones I left out in the middle, it would add to 100%. So when we compare the 2007 to 2017, the difference is suggesting a shift in the percent distribution of our labor force over the decade. And so you can see for these higher skilled, higher paid jobs, a larger percentage of our labor force in 2017 was in those higher skilled, higher paying jobs. And a smaller percentage of our labor force, not necessarily a smaller number, because remember our population is growing, but a smaller percentage of our labor force are working in these lower skilled, lower paid jobs. So essentially that is, the implication from that is that Texas has an increasing demand for skilled labor. And that puts a lot of pressure on us to ensure that our labor force is, that our children are aging up through our school systems and entering the labor force prepared to assume positions in these higher skilled, higher paid occupations. Yet when we look at educational attainment by race and ethnicity, we see substantial variation. And in particular, I'll highlight non-Hispanic white. The non-Hispanic white population, 70% of them have some college exposure or more, compared to the Latino population where only 40% have some college or more. That's a pretty big differential, where something like a little more than 60% have high school equivalent or less of the Latino population. So not even half of the Latino population have some exposure to college. And that would include associate's degrees, certificates that people may get in post-secondary education. And so I think I want to press you to think back to some of the earlier slides where I was talking about population change, where Latino population is attributable for 50% of our population change over the decade. The Latino population is driving the growth. It's almost half, it's almost equivalent to the non-Hispanic white population in terms of size. And I would argue in 2022, it probably is equivalent or exceeds the non-Hispanic white population in size. And so if we're not able to change this, the percent distribution here for Hispanics, and have a higher percentage of them with some post-secondary exposure, it's really suggesting that our labor force is not going to be prepared to fill the jobs that we are creating in the state, which are increasingly higher skilled, higher paid jobs. When we look at change in the educational attainment, so this is change in the percent of the adult population, 25 years of age and older, that have a bachelor's degree or higher. Here you can see that, for all the groups, we're seeing, all the race ethnic groups, we're seeing improvements in terms of the percent that have a bachelor's degree or higher. But Latinos still lag significantly behind all of the other race ethnic groups. However, when we look at change and calculate that as a percent change, you can see the percent increase, that the absolute percent increase is probably somewhat equivalent across them, but the percent change for non-Hispanic white is only a little over 18%, Asian a little about 15%, and for African American over 50% increase. So that's pretty dramatic and fast change that we're seeing there. I would argue that that's good news, but we need to accelerate that. I mean, we need to kind of get the Latino population so that it's approaching parity, certainly with African American, hopefully with the non-Hispanic white population in a relatively short period of time of, well, I'll just say the coming decade. When we look at enrollment, and this is one of the things that is an important thing to consider. When we look at enrollment in college and graduate education by race and ethnicity, we've seen dramatic improvements for the Hispanic population. When I had originally done this, it just went through 2017, and I was like, oh, by 2019, we're the Latino, because the trend was such that Latino population was going to probably, in terms of enrollment, at least match, if not exceed, the non-Hispanic white population, but it didn't quite make that. But still, this is actually really good news in terms of the trend that we've seen here, and hopefully we'll see this continue going into the future. And then when we look at enrollment in 2-year institutions versus 4-year, so the 2 years, the red line, we were seeing higher enrollment in 2-year institutions, and I would argue associate degrees and certificate programs, the post-secondary certificate programs, those are things that Texas's economy is hungry for. The people that essentially skilled labor with very specific skills, technical skills, that people can come out of these programs, go to work for companies and really contribute to their bottom line. But we've seen in the last couple of years a decline in those programs, and not necessarily a dramatic increase in the public university, the 4-year institution increase. When we look at undergraduate college enrollment by state, and this is highlighting the issue that I was emphasizing earlier about our declining child population as a function of declining fertility. If you look at these states to the left, I mean, Michigan's probably the most extreme. Most of these states have had fertility below replacement for a decade or more. So essentially their child population aging into the college going years is declining because those cohorts have aged into post-secondary education. So their enrollment is declining. Texas, Connecticut, and Utah and Vermont are the only state, and Vermont has below replacement fertility. Utah above, and Connecticut has below replacement fertility. But Texas has continued to, essentially as the one state where we've seen increases in undergraduate college enrollment over the decade. So that's pretty impressive. But again, I would argue that we're likely to see in the coming 10 years that there's going to be increasing pressure on this. And then the other part of this is, from a university enrollment perspective, is all of these places have empty seats in their colleges and universities. And they're probably looking to Texas as a place where, well, they have a lot of young people there. So maybe we could offer them a scholarship and get them to come to our institutions and essentially potentially pull away enrollment from Texas colleges and universities as a function of that. When we look at the distribution of educational attainment in the state by county, you can see that essentially the urban core, the population triangle area has very significant percentage of the population that are have bachelor's degrees or higher. That's where the higher paid, higher skilled jobs are. If you look at the Metroplex area of Denton and Collin County, or kind of where in Rockwall, tremendous growth in the technology sectors are occurring. Same thing with Travis and Williamson and Hayes County. And then Fort Bend is growing very dramatically. And again, it's a higher skilled, higher paid labor force, significant Asian population there as well as in Collin County. When you go out west, these estimates become pretty sparse, and so there's a large margin of error. And so even though Brewster County probably does have a higher percentage of the population with bachelor's degree, there probably is also some error associated with that estimate. When we look at access to the internet, there are some pretty significant disparities in the state. If you look at South Texas, significant proportion of the households don't have an internet subscription. And that certainly was an issue for us during this last census, where the Census Bureau was making an effort to count population using internet response. But again, if you look at the rural parts of the state, that's where they're lacking access to internet, which is also access to information. If you look at the urban core counties, with the exception of Dallas and Harris County, and I guess Bear County, and they're kind of really high prevalence of internet access. And that doesn't mean that Dallas, Harris, and Bear County don't have, but there's also a higher percentage of the population living in poverty in those three counties than in those surrounding counties. When we look at young children, and certainly there's been a strong effort in Texas and around the country to try to ensure that children that are pre-K are gaining access to some kind of enrichment program, such as in San Antonio, we have a program called Pre-K for SA. Another example might be the Head Start program, but essentially pre-K education. And a lot of school districts around the state are now offering that. And so when we look at the trends here, you see essentially a positive trend in Texas for the percentage of children that are getting exposure to pre-K enrichment educational exposures. So that's good news for the state, because certainly that then has been linked pretty strongly to educational success. So it's a readiness to learn when kids enter first grade and go through primary and secondary school. And then similarly, if we look at those children 3 to 4 that were enrolled in public schools, so that's public pre-K as opposed to private pre-K, we've seen a positive trend with that as well. So now I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about the projected population in the state. You can see here are the projections that we've produced. The green line here is the most recent projection we produced using a migration scenario between 2010 and 2015. It lines up pretty closely with the census. We weren't exactly where the census was from the projection. The population base for this projection series is 2010. And then we have other scenarios, high scenario, assuming migration was higher, low scenario, assuming that migration was half of what it was between 2000 and 2010. And then zero migration, that's just natural increase. So Texas would continue to grow even if there was no migration occurring. But you can see our projection has continued growth, or the one that we think is most accurate, with having the Texas population at over 47 million by 2050. When we look at this change and projected change by race and ethnicity, you can see the Latino population is projected to exceed the non-Hispanic white population right about 2022, which is about where we are now. And so that may have happened last year, or it may have happened in 2022. You can see the Asian population, if it continues to grow as fast as it has, potentially being at parity with the African-American population in the state by 2050. When we look at the young population and their racial and ethnic composition and project that forward, and meaning the college going ages 18 to 24, you can see that really the Latino population is the segment of the population that's driving much of that. Significant increase, even though a smaller percentage of the total population among Asian. Non-Hispanic whites almost flat in terms of growth of our young population, and African American kind of growth, but relatively slow compared to Hispanic and Asian. Okay, well, that concludes all of my comments today. Thank you very much for your time and attention.